Imagine waking up one morning, stepping outside your home and being forced to wear a metal mask that locks around your skull. Not for a day, sometimes for weeks. You cannot speak, you cannot eat properly, and everyone who passes you on the street knows exactly why you're wearing it. This wasn't a nightmare. This wasn't fiction. This was real life in real towns, enforced by real courts for a crime as simple as gossiping too much. For thousands of years, human beings have wrestled with the same question. What do you do with someone who breaks the rules? Every culture, every century, every corner of the earth has answered that question differently. And some of those answers are so strange, so theatrical, so unexpectedly cruel or bizarrely clever that they sound more like myths than history. But they are not myths. They happened. Court records confirm them. Travelers wrote about them. Archaeologists have found the devices used to carry them out. And today, we're going to walk through some of the strangest punishments ever recorded, not to shock you, but to understand something deeper. Because the way a society punishes its people reveals exactly what that society feared, what it valued, and what it believed a human being deserved when they stepped out of line. Let's begin somewhere unexpected, not in a dungeon, not on a battlefield, but in the quiet streets of early modern Europe, where the greatest threat to public order, according to the law at the time, wasn't theft or violence. It was talking. In England, Scotland, and parts of colonial America, a device known as the Scold's bridle was used almost exclusively against women accused of being quarrelsome, gossiping too openly, or simply speaking out of turn in a way that authorities considered disruptive. The device was an iron cage that fit over the head, with a metal plate that pressed down onto the tongue, sometimes fitted with spikes to make speaking, or even swallowing, painful. The woman would then be paraded through the streets, sometimes led on a chain like livestock, while the community watched. According to historical records, the punishment wasn't just about silencing the individual. It was about public humiliation as a tool of social control. Historians studying this period point out that accusations of scolding were rarely about actual harm. They were about women who challenged authority, argued with husbands, or spoke too freely in a society that expected female silence. The punishment fit the crime only in the eyes of the people enforcing it. To everyone else, it was a public spectacle designed to remind an entire town who held power and who didn't. This idea, punishment as performance, shows up again and again throughout history. Because in eras before mass media, before newspapers, before any way to broadcast a message to thousands of people at once, the town square was the stage, and the human body became the message. Take the stocks and the pillory, common across medieval and early modern Europe. A person's hands, feet, or head would be locked into a wooden frame in the middle of town, leaving them completely immobile and exposed. Passers-by weren't just allowed to look. They were often encouraged to throw rotten food, mud, or worse. In some cases, the punishment escalated far beyond humiliation, and prisoners were seriously injured or even killed by the crowd. The state didn't need to lift a finger. It simply handed the punishment over to public anger and let human nature do the rest. What's fascinating, according to legal historians, is how calculated this was. The severity of humiliation could be adjusted based on the crime. Minor offenses meant a few hours in the stocks. Serious fraud or dangerous slander could mean days. The punishment scaled not just with the crime, but with how badly the authorities wanted the community to remember it. Now let's cross the ocean, into the age of sail, where the rules of punishment became even stranger, because the setting itself was unlike anything on land. Life aboard a wooden ship in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries was brutal by default. Cramped quarters, disease, storms, isolation from the rest of the world for months at a time. Naval commanders needed discipline that could be enforced instantly, without courts, without appeals, sometimes without even a trial. Out of that necessity came one of the most feared punishments in maritime history, keelhauling. The process was simple to describe and horrifying to imagine. A sailor accused of a serious offense would have ropes tied around his body, then be thrown overboard on one side of the ship and dragged underneath the hull, through freezing water and against a surface covered in sharp barnacles, before being pulled up on the other side. Some sailors survived. Many did not. Those who did often carried permanent scars, both physical and psychological, for the rest of their lives. According to maritime historians, keelhauling was less common than popular legend suggests, largely because it so often resulted in death, which defeated the purpose of using a sailor as a working crew member. But its reputation alone was often enough. Fear became the real weapon. A punishment didn't need to be used constantly to control behavior. It just needed to be terrifying enough that everyone imagined it happening to them. This pattern, using fear as a preventative tool rather than relying only on actual punishment, appears across almost every culture we're about to explore. And nowhere is that clearer than in the courts of ancient Rome, where punishment often blurred into public entertainment. Roman law recognized an enormous range of offenses and an equally enormous range of punishments, many of them designed specifically to be witnessed by large crowds. Public executions were staged in amphitheaters. Sentences were carried out as spectacle, sometimes tied to religious or mythological themes, turning the punishment of a criminal into a kind of dramatic performance for tens of thousands of spectators. Historians studying Roman penal practices note that this wasn't incidental. It was intentional social engineering. A punishment carried out privately taught a lesson to one person. A punishment carried out in front of an arena full of citizens taught a lesson to an entire city. The goal wasn't just justice in the modern sense. It was deterrence through spectacle, reinforcing the absolute authority of the state in the most visible, unforgettable way possible. Some ancient punishments were engineering marvels in the worst possible sense. According to ancient sources, a bronze craftsman in the Greek colony of Acragas is said to have built a hollow bronze bull, designed so that a person sealed inside would be roasted alive over a fire lit beneath it, while a system of tubes converted their screams into what was described as the sound of a bellowing bull. The story of the brazen bull has been repeated by multiple ancient historians, though modern scholars debate how much of it is verified fact and how much is exaggerated legend meant to illustrate the cruelty of a particular tyrant. What we do know is that the story itself, true or embellished, was used for centuries as a moral lesson about the corrupting nature of absolute power, because according to the same ancient accounts, the tyrant who commissioned the device is said to have tested it first on the inventor himself. Whether every detail of that story happened exactly as described, historians remain divided, but its persistence across centuries tells us something important. Ancient societies weren't just interested in punishing wrongdoing. They were fascinated, sometimes uncomfortably so, by the idea of punishment as a kind of dark theater, a demonstration of what happens when power goes unchecked. Let's move further east, into Imperial China, where the legal system developed an entirely different philosophy, one deeply tied to the idea of public shame as a form of social correction. The Cangue was a large, flat wooden board locked around a person's neck, often inscribed with the details of their crime for anyone to read. Unlike the stocks, which kept a person in one place, the Cangue was sometimes designed to be worn while the person continued their daily life, unable to feed themselves without help, unable to lie down comfortably, forced to carry both the physical weight and the public humiliation of their punishment everywhere they went. Some versions weighed so much that simply wearing one for an extended sentence caused serious physical harm. According to scholars of Chinese legal history, this reflected a broader philosophy embedded in Confucian thought, the idea that social harmony depended on visible correction. A crime wasn't just a violation against a victim. It was a disruption of the entire social order, and the punishment needed to restore that order publicly, in a way the whole community could witness and understand. This same logic, punishment as a restoration of visible order, shows up in a strikingly different form across the Ottoman Empire and parts of the Islamic world, where certain punishments were tied directly to the nature of the crime itself. A legal philosophy sometimes referred to as a form of symbolic or mirrored justice. A merchant caught cheating customers with false weights, for example, might be punished in a way specifically designed to reference the dishonest scale itself, publicly displayed alongside the evidence of the fraud, so that the connection between crime and consequence was impossible to miss. Historians studying Ottoman legal codes point out that many recorded punishments were less about physical harm and more about permanent public association. Once you were punished for a specific crime in a specific, symbolic way, that identity followed you. Your community would remember, which, in a world without newspapers, without photographs, without any digital record, was sometimes a harsher sentence than physical pain. Now let's return to the West, to a punishment so strange it sounds almost comedic today, until you understand what it was actually designed to do. Across parts of medieval and early modern Europe, particularly in England, communities developed what became known as the drunkard's cloak. Someone convicted of public drunkenness would be forced to wear a heavy wooden barrel with holes cut for the arms and head, then paraded through town. The barrel restricted movement, made the person look absurd, and turned a private failing into a public performance of ridicule. It wasn't designed to cause serious physical harm. It was designed to make the punishment impossible to hide from, and impossible for the community to forget. What's remarkable, according to social historians, is how effective shame-based punishment could be in small, tightly knit communities. In a world where your reputation determined your ability to trade, marry, worship, and belong, public humiliation could be more devastating long-term than a fine or even a brief imprisonment. The wound wasn't physical, it was social, and in many ways it never fully healed. Let's travel across the Atlantic now, to colonial America, where European punishment traditions collided with new anxieties, new religious pressures, and new fears about maintaining order in fragile, isolated settlements. Puritan New England developed an entire culture around public correction. The most famous example, immortalized centuries later in literature, involved forcing individuals convicted of moral offenses to wear a visible symbol of their crime in public, sometimes for years. But this was only one method among many. Colonial courts also used branding, where a letter representing the crime was burned into the skin, ensuring the punishment was permanent and unmistakable no matter where the person traveled afterward. According to historians of colonial law, these punishments reflected a society deeply anxious about its own survival. Small settlements depended on absolute cohesion to survive harsh winters, food shortages, and constant uncertainty. A single person's moral failure, in the eyes of Puritan leadership, wasn't just their own business. It was considered a threat to divine favor over the entire community. Punishment, therefore, needed to be visible, permanent, and impossible to ignore, because the stakes, at least in their minds, extended far beyond the individual. Now let's shift to a punishment that reveals something different entirely, not cruelty for its own sake, but an almost poetic sense of consequence. In parts of ancient and medieval Russia, as well as several other regions across history, certain forms of exile were used not merely as removal from society, but as a calculated psychological punishment. Being sent to Siberia, for example, wasn't just about distance. It was about isolation in an environment so vast and unforgiving that escape itself became almost meaningless. There was nowhere to run, because the land itself was the prison. Some historians describe this as one of the earliest examples of environment being deliberately weaponized as a form of incarceration, centuries before the modern prison system existed in anything like its current form. Every one of these punishments, the iron mask, the wooden barrel, the branding iron, the endless frozen wilderness, tells us something the history books rarely say directly. Punishment has never really been just about the individual being punished. It has always been a message written for everyone else watching. That's the pattern running underneath every single example we've explored today. Whether it was ancient Rome turning execution into public spectacle, Puritan New England branding sin onto skin, or a small English village mocking a drunkard in a barrel, the target was never just the person being punished. It was the entire community standing around them, learning exactly what would happen if they crossed the same line. And that raises an uncomfortable question, one that historians and legal scholars continue to debate today. Were these punishments really about justice? Or were they about control, using fear and public humiliation as tools far more powerful than any prison wall? Modern legal systems have moved away from most of these methods, shaped by centuries of philosophical and ethical debate about human dignity, rehabilitation, and the actual effectiveness of shame as a deterrent. Many historians argue that public humiliation punishments were, in fact, remarkably ineffective at actually reducing crime long-term, and that their real function was maintaining social hierarchies rather than achieving genuine justice. Others argue that in tightly bound, pre-modern communities, the threat of permanent social exile through shame was, however uncomfortable to consider, one of the only tools available to maintain any order at all in the absence of formal police forces or prison systems. There's no single correct answer, and that's exactly why these punishments continue to fascinate us centuries later. They force us to ask what justice actually means, whether it changes depending on the century, the culture, or the fears of the people enforcing it, and whether the line between justice and cruelty has ever really been as clear as we like to believe. So here's the question worth sitting with. If future generations looked back at how we punish people today, our prisons, our systems, our own methods of public shamming through headlines and social media, would they see justice? Or would they see the exact same pattern repeating itself, just wearing a different mask? What do you think? Which punishment from history surprised you the most? And do you think our modern methods are really as different as we assume? Let us know in the comments below.